So what we've got so far in our pizza reducer, we have a few items of state. We've got data, which is going to be an array, got loaded, loading. So what we actually want to do is somehow display this particular property, which will be our array of pizzas, in the actual Angular application. So the way that we do this is through something called a selector. Now before we get started, what we're going to do is actually populate this initial state with some values. So what we're going to do is jump into the db.json, and we're going to take any pizza. You can just select any one that you want, and we can copy that whole object. Now what we're going to do is just paste it for now inside of this data. So it's got the name of the pizza, it's got the toppings, so we're providing some initial state to our pizzas. So we're going to end up with one pizza once we've finalized creating a selector, which allows us to select this particular slice of state. Now what we actually want to do before any of that is set up our container component to accept the store. At the moment we're just using the pizza service. So we're going to completely eradicate anything to do with services. We don't need the service. So what I'm going to do is just simply inside of the ng on init, I'm going to delete this. I'm going to remove the pizza service, and we can also go up the top and just delete that pizza service as well. Now what we want to do from NGRX is import the store from @NGRX store. We also want to import the observable for type checking. So we're going to say rxjs/observable. Underneath here, we can also say we want to import everything as from the store, and we get that from back a few directories, and we go and grab that store folder. So when we actually access this from store, we can see inside of here, we can go from store, and we can immediately start to see things that are actually happening. Now, what we actually want to do is allow us to pass the product state, so we can actually type check this inside of a component. So inside the constructor, we can say private store is going to be of type store. Now this accepts a generic type as well. So we can say from store, and you can see here that we can access that product state. So this is type checking that anything that we access inside of here alongside of our product state. So this means that we can only select things from the store that correspond or exist in the product state. So what we're going to do first off is actually look at the store's select method. How do we obtain properties from our store? This is where we use the store's select. So we can say this.store select. Now we need to pass in either a string or we can pass in a function. If we pass in a function, it will return us a slice of state. Now for this, what I'm going to do is just say select me the products. Now we're doing this because we have a slice of state, and you can see the red underline. So what I'm going to do is just type this as any for now. And we'll actually explain this in the next piece, because what we need to do is essentially create a selector with a top level property of products so that we can jump a level down into our data structure to be able to access different properties. So let's subscribe and see what we actually get given. So we're going to say that this is the state, and we're going to console log the state object. So let's go ahead and take a look in the browser. So in the browser, we do not have any pizzas because we've just removed that actual service portion. So nothing is actually getting loaded. However, inside the products component, we've just set up that console log, and we've said, give us the representation of the state. So we just created a pizza reducer, and we called that the pizzas. The pizza reducer then manages a small selection of state, which, if you remember, had the data, the loaded, and the loading. So when we expand this, we actually get those pieces of data. So this currently is 100% bound to our store. We've said store select, give me the state for this particular module, which in our case is the products module. And when we registered our store, we said store module for feature, and we passed in that string which says products. So that's why we've asked in the select method for a property called string. Now inside of here, if we open this up, we have this data with that one item that we just pasted in from our db.json. So that now exists in our single source of truth, and this is the state representation. You may be thinking, okay, how do we get this data into our component? Now for this, we need to use something called a selector. And a selector is essentially a function where we can compose different levels of state and we can return a new piece of state. So let's jump back to the code and create our first selector, which will allow us to render this one pizza into our Angular application. So what we need to do in our reducers, because we have these different slices of state, and I'll just use the interface here. So we've got data, we've got loaded, and we've got loading. So what we can do is export a function which allows NGRX to essentially access those properties without us needing to repeat ourselves over and over again. So a selector is something you use to compose state, and then we can actually use the selector alongside store.select in our components. So underneath, what we'll do, we'll go all the way down underneath our reducer. This is where we want to start exporting some levels of state. So let's start off nice and easy. We're going to say export a const, and we're going to say get pizzas loading. Now this is going to be just a function that accepts the state, and that will be of type pizza state. So this is the piece of state that will given to us, and it's going to be of type pizza state. Now all we need to do at this point is return state dot, and we've got data, loaded, and loading. Now we're going to use loading because we are having the loading as the actual constant name that we're exporting. So underneath here, we can duplicate this. We're going to say loaded, and we'll change this one over to loaded. So we'll just change this one to get pizzas, and we can return that data property. So these are small functions that get past the small level of the pizza state, and at that point in time, we are down in our data structure. So this is a good practice. Put these underneath your reducers, and we can export the state loading, export the state loaded, and the data property. So now we can compose things one level up and actually pass this into what we call a create selector function. So we can save that, and what we want to do is jump into this index.ts here, where we have already registered our reducers. So this is what we need to actually do to create the base level of our state object. Now what we'll do is create these selectors ahead of time, and then we'll go and explain them piece by piece. So let's export another constant, and we're going to call this the get products state. So this is going to be a constant which holds a selector for our entire lazy loaded module. Now to create a selector, what we need to do is jump into our NGRX store inputs, and we can import something called a create feature selector. So we'll copy this value and we'll say equals create feature selector. Now what we want to do in the middle is pass in a string called products. Now you may be thinking, where does this string of products come from? This was actually when we created our module. We're saying that we have a store module, and this particular feature starts with an object property called products. So anything in this feature module is relied on, and it's underneath a property called products. So all we're doing here is creating a base reference to that products property on our state. Now because we have TypeScript here, what we can actually do is pass in the product state as the generic type. Now when I save this, I'll just put this on 2 lines so we can see things a bit more clearly. Now to get this working in our component, we actually need another selector to essentially compose our product state. So we take that top level products, and we'll explain this with an object momentarily so we can represent the data structure and how these feature selectors and the create selector work together. So underneath here, what we're going to do is add a comment saying the pizza state. And what we essentially want to do is export another const, and we're going to say get pizza state. What this is going to do is return us the products.pizzas. So we're going from the top, we're going down from products, and then we're selecting that pizza's piece of state. Now we can do this by using create selector instead of the create feature selector. So what we'll do is quickly jump up the top, and we'll add this before the create feature selector. So we can do create selector. So import that. What we can do is then go down to our get pizza state, and we can just simply call create selector as a function. Now the create selector function, we can pass in other selectors, or we could pass in the functions that we just created inside of here. So we're actually going to take something like get pizzas momentarily and pass it into a selector, which we can then pass to a component to select that slice of data all the way down the state tree. So use create selector. This is how we compose our application state. So how do we get the pizza state? What we want to do is just create at the moment a reference to the next step down the state tree. So the first argument, what we're going to do is add get product state. So that's one selector that we've just added. The get product state we've just defined above. So essentially this is going to create a selector starting from the product. So it's going to look at dot products, and then we're going to jump down another level. Now the second argument to a create selector can be another selector, or it can be a function that you just simply type out like so. So what we're going to get given is in fact the state, and that's going to be of type product state. What I'll do is just hide the sidebar so we can see this a bit clearly. So inside of this, what we want to actually return is state, and you can see here when I press dot, we only have pizzas available. So we can only return state.pizzas. Now you can just see that when I hit save, that actually jumps onto a new line. I'm using something called Prettier, which you can see down here. I'd highly recommend you install it. It keeps all your code consistent. If you're working in teams, it's also really handy to keep your code consistency and all the style conformed. So this has put this on a new line because the line length was getting too long to read. So we can open up the sidebar again and we can see things a little bit more clearly. So at this point, we actually have get pizza state, which is going to pass in the products, which is on our state. And then we're actually going to return state.pizzas. Essentially what we're saying is, give me the products. Okay, here's the products. Now give me the pizzas. So the next step, when we're inside the pizzas, we're actually in pizza reducer land. So inside of our pizza reducer, we have data, we have loaded, we have loading. Down at the bottom, what we did is actually export some functions that we can compose with our selectors. So we're actually going to use get pizzas. So we'll jump back into here and we're going to create another selector. We're going to say export const get all pizzas. We can then again use create selector. Now because we want to actually jump straight down the state tree, we can pass in get pizza state as the first argument. Now the next argument we can say from pizzas, and we have a couple of options available to us. So we've got get pizzas loading, get pizzas loaded. So what we're actually going to ask for is the get pizzas. So we can save this. I'll just hide the sidebar so we can see this nice and clearly. Now what we're going to do as well while we're here is just duplicate this, and we're going to say get pizzas loaded. We're going to say get pizzas loading. Now we can keep the pizza state because this selector is being passed in, which means that we start from products, we return state.pizzas. Now in this one, instead of get pizzas, we're going to ask for get pizzas loaded. Similarly, on this one, we're going to say get pizzas loading. So now we have 3 finished selectors. And this is probably the most difficult piece to kind of get your head around. And it's hard to demonstrate how these work without writing them first and then explaining. So let's move on to a small explanation. Let's assume we have a JavaScript object and we have products. This is what our state tree looks like at the moment. To avoid some red underlines, what I'll do is just put const state equals. So inside of this products, we've defined that we're going to have some level of pizzas. Now our pizza reducer actually manages this slice of state, which has that data property. It also has the loaded, which we can set as false, and it also has the loading. So this is essentially our entire NGRX store state tree. We create products as a feature module. So when our products module is loaded, NGRX store can add this dynamically and the reducers dynamically to our state tree. When the reducers are added to the state tree, we've got one reducer inside at the moment, which is called pizzas, and we bind our pizzas reducer to it. Inside of that, we have the data, the loaded and the loading. So we're essentially stepping through this state tree by using selector functions. We're first getting the product state, so we're essentially getting a reference to this. Then inside, what we're doing is getting the pizza state. So we pass in the product state, which is this one here, and we're asking to go down a level, and we want the pizzas. This is why we're returning state.pizzas. Now, when state.pizzas is returned, we essentially end up with an object that looks a little bit like this. So we, in fact, at the end of that selector, we've got 3 properties that we can access. But then let's just say that we want one property, such as the data. That's where we can create another selector and say, get me the pizzas. If we want the loaded properties, both the booleans, we can ask for them individually. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense, and I think as we continue, this will help you understand what the selectors are actually doing. We're just asking for different properties at different levels, and it's completely up to us how we want to compose them. So what we'll do is save that out. We've pretty much finished in this sense. So the whole point of a selector is allows us to essentially separate our application state with our component trees. And we can compose our application state and then simply pass the slices that we need to a particular component. So in our case, when we have the products component, we want to essentially get all of the pizzas. Now in our pizzas reducer, if we just go back, at the top we have this hard-coded piece of information already, which is our data property. So if we jump into products, what we can do at the moment, we have store select any, and we have products, and we're subscribing to that state, and we have console log state. So instead of passing in a string, because we would have to manually go down from products, and then we'd have to go to pizzas, and then we'd have to go down into data and actually do this every single time. So we can compose these selectors, and we can simply say from store, and you can see here that we have get all pizzas. We can know if they're loaded. We can see if they're loading. We don't want to access any of these states, so we're just going to ask for all of the pizzas. Now, because we're doing this, we can get rid of the generic type, and we can save this out. And when we go back to the browser, we'll see something rather interesting. So we're back in the browser, and we have an array with that one hard-coded pizza in. So at this point, we have successfully written a few selectors to allow us to jump down our state tree, and just using a single function, we can traverse the state tree and get given back the data that we ask for. So this is really, really powerful. Now, the interesting thing is that store select actually returns an observable, which we know because we are now subscribing to it. However, with Angular, we have the async pipe where we can pass the observable straight to our template. So let's go back and implement the async pipe, and we should see our pizza being rendered out in the DOM. So at this point, we are subscribing. We could actually, in fact, say this.pizzas and then equals the current state, which essentially would be our array of pizzas like we've just logged out in the console. However, we don't kind of like this approach. It's quite long-winded, and we should take advantage of some of the Angular features. So what we're going to say is this.pizzas. I'm going to add a $, on the end. Now the $, actually means that this variable is an observable. This is a complete style choice. You don't have to put the $, but it's kind of nice to see what is an observable and what isn't an observable. Now, because we've made that change, we need to say $, and we need to say observable of pizzas. Now the observable has already been imported because we imported it up here. We've imported the store. We've got our selectors from everything inside the store. We've got our pizza interface. Now, the next piece that we need to do is actually use the async pipe to subscribe to our observable. So let's go ahead. We've got the pizzas, which is referenced in 2 places. So what I'll do is just quickly highlight both of them. And we can say pizza with the $, and simply async. So what this will do is take that observable that's given to us from the store. The store will then call the select function. It will then compose our selectors for us. It will then return that single slice of state that we're asking for. So here we are getting an array passed directly to our component via our selector function. We then bind that to the pizzas, and then we subscribe with the async pipe. So let's go and check this out in the browser. So in the browser, we have Seaside Surfing, our nice favorite pizza with a few toppings. This side of the application, when we click through onto a pizza, is completely outside of NGRX. There's a lot of things happening here. We can visualize these toppings, we can save changes, we can delete the pizza, we can create new ones on this particular view. But we're interested in what we've done here so far. We have completely refactored this application in this particular view to use an observable driven approach. We've created a reducer and we're using some hard-coded data inside an array. So in just a few videos, what we've done, we've created some actions. So we've got load pizzas fail, and the success. Now we haven't dispatched any of these actions yet, like we did in the previous chapter where we built our own Redux store, but we're going to introduce you shortly to NGRX effects, where we can go and ask for data from the server. Now we created these actions so that we could actually create our switch cases inside of the reducer, and all we do is just simply return the state. We don't have any actions that are firing just yet, which means that this line of code here is actually being called, which is our initial state, which gets returned to the reducer. So the initial state contains this big data object, which is why we're seeing just that one pizza in the actual DOM. And what we've done in this video is ask for that data property, and we've gone into our index.ts and we've composed a few selectors. And as we continue through the course, I think you'll get much more used to using these selectors, because the more we use them, the more we'll be comfortable with them and understand what they're doing.